infantry brigade as they do their JRTC rotation types of aircraft, including the AH-64, the UH-60.
Well, good morning. And even though I'm not with you today physically, I really appreciate the fact that you're letting me be with you today in spirit. And we all know that March is indeed the Heritage Month for the North Carolina National Guard. In addition to the reason why we are here today, let us also be reminded that this month, on the 15th, we celebrated the 68th birthday of the North Carolina Air National Guard. And just the other day, we also celebrated the 22nd birthday of the Tar Heel Challenge Academy. But today is the culminating event of the North Carolina National Guard Heritage Month. It is indeed our 353rd birthday. So happy birthday to the North Carolina National Guard. You see, it was 353 years ago today, in 1663, that the Carolina Charter was first signed. They granted the right to levy, muster, and train men in order to defend the property and peoples of the Carolinas. You see, the National Guard is the oldest military component of this great nation, and indeed one of the oldest institutions in North Carolina. You see, we have a very rich and proud heritage, and today is a great opportunity for all of us to celebrate our heritage and for all of us to reflect upon our contributions to both our state and our nation. So on behalf of the entire leadership team of the North Carolina National Guard, I want to send a sincere thank you to all of you and to the nearly 12,000 citizen soldiers and airmen of the North Carolina National Guard. I'd like to thank you for your hard work, your professionalism, and your commitment that has contributed to our rich heritage and makes the North Carolina National Guard an always ready team. Happy 353rd birthday, North Carolina National Guard.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here to celebrate the North Carolina National Guard's 353rd birthday. Today, we will gain a brief history about the origins of the North Carolina National Guard. In particular, the French and Indian War Service of the North Carolina Provincials, who are the precursor of the modern-day North Carolina National Guard. Speaking today is Mr. Scott Douglas. Mr. Douglas studied history at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro and has worked at several federal, state, and privately owned historic sites in both Virginia and North Carolina. Mr. Douglas currently works at the Fort Dobbs Historic Site, where he has worked since 2007 and has served as site manager since 2014. Please welcome Mr. Scott Douglas.
My name is Scott Douglas, and I'm the site manager at Fort Dobbs State Historic Site. And it's a real pleasure to be here today on behalf of the people of North Carolina to thank you for your service, to thank the Guard for its long history. And again, we're going to be talking about the origins of a little-known part of National Guard history in North Carolina, the French and Indian War. French and Indian War is a subject that isn't really covered very well in public school. When it is brought up, it's something that just happened before the American Revolution. It's something that's taught in passing. But here in North Carolina, it was a very significant part of our colony and now state's history. And again, it has great significance on the history of the National Guard itself. So I'd just like to provide an outline today of the contributions that our colony made in this conflict 260 years ago, and more importantly, tell the story of those servicemen who fought and died for their country. So, North America is mirroring conflicts in Europe through the late 17th and early 18th century. From 1690 to 1748, there's a series of wars that all begin in Europe itself for the most part, and spill over here to the North American continent. We see England and France fighting each other for dominance over the world's oceans, fighting each other over their colonies overseas, including North America. But we're usually a backwater. It's kind of a forgotten part of each of these early wars that goes on. So things are a little bit different in the 1750s. We actually see the start of this conflict begin not over in Europe, but in America itself. Around the year 1750, this map illustrates the colonial situation here. The Spanish have the western part of North America. They own Texas. They own Florida. The French, you can see, lay claim to a huge section of territory stretching from Louisiana all the way up to modern-day Canada and Quebec, and pretty much claiming dominance over all the land in the interior of the continent. The English have only a small strip of colonies, 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard. So at first glance, it seems that the English are at a disadvantage. But you have to look at the goals of these European powers as to why they're settling North America to begin with, what they're hoping to get out of these colonies here. The French, though they claim all this land, they don't have a huge population. There's only about 50,000 actual French citizens that live in all of that territory. Their king has treaties with the Indian nations that actually inhabit most of that region, and France is benefiting from the trade in animal pelts, deer skins, beaver pelts that are sent back over to Europe. But they don't really have much in the way of cities or a population. The English, by contrast, even though we just have a very small strip of land, including North Carolina, we are here for land. There was a huge migration of people coming across the Atlantic Ocean in the mid-18th century. We see people from England, people from especially the northern part of Ireland, people from different German principalities that are allied with England, all coming across for the chance at a new, better life here in North America. And the main way that they can gain a foothold and really make themselves prosperous is to get more land. But you see, we're blocked in. We have the Atlantic Ocean to the east, and then we have the French to the west. But that's the only direction England's colonies can grow in. So we see a rising tension between France and England, and as the English are pushing their boundaries further and further to the west. Everything kind of comes to a head in 1754. We see a force of Virginia soldiers led by a young, inexperienced officer named George Washington. You probably never heard of him before. He was only 22 years old at the time. On his first military command, he is sent into the woods of what is now western Pennsylvania. And his goal, his objective, is to remove the French that are also moving into that territory. The French are constructing a series of forts up the Mississippi and down the Ohio River valleys, eventually completely connecting all of their possessions and forming a boundary that they hope the English can't cross. So Washington leads his men into the wilderness in the spring of 1754. They encounter a patrol of French troops nearby, and they actually ambush them in a dawn attack that's wildly successful for Washington. It's his first taste of combat. He later wrote, as an inexperienced officer might, that he thought that he heard the sound of bullets whistling by his head, and thought that there was something charming in the sound. He only thinks that because he succeeds. He loses one man, the French party is wiped out. But these are the first shots of what becomes the first true world war. During the course of 9 years of fighting here in North America, that starts here in North America, combat spreads around the entire world as France and England are fighting not only in Europe itself, but in their colonial possessions in the Philippines, in Africa, in the West Indies, in India itself. This is a global conflict. Dozens of countries are pulled into it, and it all starts in the woods of Pennsylvania with young George Washington. As a member of the English Parliament, wrote, "A young Virginian has set the world on fire," and that was truly the case. This war is known as the French and Indian War here in North America, but worldwide it's called the 7 Years' War because it takes about another 2 years for that fighting worldwide to catch on. But North Carolina is the first of the other English colonies to respond to Virginia's call for assistance. Virginia has started the shooting part of this war. There's no unified government of all the colonies here in North America. Each colony is very autonomous. They do their own thing under the British Crown. But Virginia puts out a call for help. North Carolina responds. It's actually the first time in colonial history that another colony sends soldiers outside of its own borders in defense of a common cause. The problem is North Carolina is not a very wealthy colony. We don't have a huge population. We don't have a very expansive economy and a lot of money to spend on military matters. So we do what we can. Our governor scrapes together a few hundred soldiers. He sends them north, actually too late to assist George Washington, who is actually cut off by a larger French force, and at a place called Fort Necessity, he is defeated, and he marches away in defeat on July 4th, 1754. But North Carolina, during the course of the war, sends her soldiers on a number of campaigns. In 1755, there's a major British effort to capture the forks of the Ohio River, where Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania stands today. The French had built a fort there called Fort Duquesne after they defeated Washington. And the English need to remove this stronghold. So we have a British army of regular, red-coated soldiers, full-time professional troops that are sent across from England itself. They're joined by soldiers from Maryland, from Virginia, and a 100-man company from North Carolina. These men march into Pennsylvania, hacking roads through the wilderness, and within a day's march of the French fort, when they finally reach that point, are ambushed in the woods by the French and their Indian allies. The English troops have no experience fighting in North America, and while their rigid tactics, standing in line shoulder to shoulder, prepare them to be a very effective force on battlefields in Europe, in the thick wilderness of Pennsylvania, they're cut apart still in their marching column. George Washington is present in that battle. This is him actually comforting the wounded General Braddock, who's mortally wounded. He goes on to survive several more scrapes through the course of the war. We see North Carolinians sent the next year in 1756 up to New York in an expedition along the Mohawk River Valley. We see then 300 of our soldiers sent to Pennsylvania again in 1758, where they do finally succeed in capturing Fort Duquesne. And we also see men later in the war, as we'll talk about in a moment, engaging the Cherokee Indians on the western frontier on the Holston River campaign in 1761. So despite being a very poor colony and not being able to muster a huge number of soldiers, we do manage to send men to take part in a lot of these major campaigns. But to backtrack to that, when the war begins, North Carolina has actually just received a brand new governor. On the left here is Governor Arthur Dobbs. He was made royal governor in 1752. He doesn't actually arrive in the colony until after fighting has started at the end of 1754. But he's a good man to have in charge in a wartime footing. He is ardently on the side of the crown. He hates the French. He hates anything Catholic, for that matter, actually, which, and the time and place is a good thing for him. He is a man of military experience. He has served on the Scottish border as a young man in the British cavalry in the 17-teens. He had experience as an engineer and a surveyor. And so to take on a wartime governorship, he's probably the best person England could have hoped to have over here. He realizes how limited the resources are here in his colony, but he does what he can to get the assembly, the legislature, to vote money every year to raise soldiers. He put it in a 1754 address that the French monarchy had a scheme hatched in hell and supported by the court of Rome to conquer all of North America. And he implored the assembly that a fire which is caught in your neighbor's house has lately spread into your own. Making them try to realize the gravity of the situation, that they need to raise soldiers, they need to defend North Carolina against the threat of the French and their Indian allies attacking. Early in the war, the French themselves aren't that huge a threat to North Carolina. While they do own the Mississippi River, they don't have any big military forces anywhere near close to us, but they do have Indian allies. And we see pretty early in the war, even in 1754, strolling parties of French allied Indians, groups like the Shawnee, who live in modern-day Ohio and West Virginia. They're attacking southern Virginia. They're even crossing just inside of our own borders. We see, in fact, a group of Catawba Indians who live down around the modern-day Charlotte area and are allies of England in this war, fight the group of Shawnee near the modern town of Salisbury. And that's even before North Carolina has any troops in the field to speak of. So they realize the need to defend our western frontier. And that edge of settlement is around the area, again, of modern-day Charlotte, kind of I-77. So Dobbs arranges for companies of full-time soldiers to be raised and put into service. And one of these companies, under the command of Captain Hugh Waddell, who's here on the right, he's a new immigrant from Ireland that's just come over when the war began. He leads a company of troops out to the frontier. They scout for a number of months, and eventually, with the help of Governor Dobbs himself, who comes out there, they select the site to build a fort. But the fort that they eventually build is called Fort Dobbs. We'll do a description of that in a second, but I did want to give you more background on the soldiers themselves. North Carolina, like every other English colony, has a militia law, and that's what the Carolina Charter set into motion, and that's what we're celebrating with the birthday of the Guard here today. The militia actually requires every free, able-bodied man between the ages of 16 and 60 to perform military service. So it's a duty as a citizen. You're required by law to be in the military in some fashion. Typically, the militia will gather a couple times a year, even in peacetime. In their local community, they'll practice military maneuvers. They'll make sure everyone actually has a gun that works. That's a big plus. They want them to bring a certain amount of ammunition with them, sidearms in the form of a sword or a cutlass. And it's a chance for their local officers, who are really just the leading politicians of the area, that's how they get their rank, to make sure that they have some men that can be put into service if there were a local emergency. But that's all the militia is for. They're purely a defensive force. They can't be sent outside of North Carolina. It's against the law for them to leave the borders of their own colony. And they're only in service for a short time. These men are civilians first. They're farmers, they're shopkeepers, they're blacksmiths. And you can't call them away from their businesses for more than a few weeks before you hurt the economy. It's really, again, good as a defensive thing, but if you need permanent full-time troops to guard strategic points, if you need to send soldiers outside of North Carolina, we need full-time troops. We're not an important enough colony for most of the war for the British Army to send soldiers here. You won't see redcoats fighting in North Carolina for most of the war. So we need someone in between, someone who's a more dependable, reliable soldier than the militia, but someone who's not in the British Army itself. And so North Carolina, as an English province, raises its own units of provincial troops. And in a way, these men, like the militia, are also a precursor to the modern-day National Guard. Provincials enlist voluntarily. They are typically in service for 6 months to sometimes a little bit over a year. When possible, they get uniforms, or at least the parts of uniforms in the style of the British Army, although we see American troops wearing blue coats in this war rather than the red of the English themselves. They're given military-grade weapons that are sent over from Great Britain. And they can be better trained. They can be the ones who are guarding forts at strategic points. And again, more importantly, as we discussed, they can go help those other colonies. Fort Dobbs itself, built on the western frontier, was begun in 1755. It was actually the only government-built fort on the entire frontier of North Carolina. Again, early on in the war, besides a few occasional Shawnee raiding parties, there's not a major threat of a big invasion. Most of the heavy fighting in this war is taking place in Pennsylvania and New York, as we discussed, and North Carolina is very much backwater. So our focus is really just on putting one company of soldiers in a pretty central spot on the frontier. The area of modern-day Statesville is about in the middle of North Carolina. It's about an equal distance from South Carolina up to Virginia. It's a good place if you want a full-time company of troops stationed to be the center of defense, basically. The Provincials, 50 men, live at Fort Dobbs, which is a 3-story high log building. It's actually made out of oak logs that are hewn with axes to be square and sit very close on top of each other to resist any small arms fire that comes against it. In the 3 floors, they have their barracks, their living space, they do their cooking all inside. There's a cellar for food and ammunition storage underneath it. It's a totally self-contained unit, basically. But it's designed in such a way that they can defend themselves if necessary. The main building was a big rectangle, but on 2 opposite corners, there's a flanker sticking out to allow for enfilade gunfire to cover all the approaches. There were enough windows and smaller loopholes that you could fire up to 100 muskets out of each floor of this building. Now, there's typically only a garrison of 50 troops there, but wherever the enemy's attacking from, they can shift men indoors and concentrate their gunfire in that different direction. But we also need to defend our coast during the war. There is a real threat that the French Navy will attack North Carolina. While we're not a very important colony for shipping, we certainly have trade going on at the port of Wilmington, which has just been founded a little before the war. We have the port of Beaufort that's open in the middle of the coast as well. And a lot of intercoastal waterways that people can get to through Pamlico Sound and up by Roanoke Island are trading to many little villages and towns along the coast. And it would be very easy for a French man of war to sail into one of these rivers when the war starts because there's no defense, basically. So Governor Dobbs, while building that one fort on the frontier, really focuses his construction efforts on the coast. We see Fort Johnston constructed at the mouth of the Cape Fear River, actually. It's where the modern-day town of Southport stands, and it's guarding the entrance to that river. It's such a strategic site that there's going to be a fort maintained at that spot until well after the American Civil War. I think there was even a submarine spotting base there in World War II, as a matter of fact. But Fort Johnston becomes North Carolina's biggest fort by far. It's built in a very European style with all these projecting angles and star points for crossfire. It has a lot of large artillery pieces that are mounted on a riverfront battery. In fact, some of you may have seen the news story in the last couple of days of a cannon that was dug up at Wilmington as they were doing some street work. It's very possible that cannon is one that was originally at Fort Johnston. They had guns there that fired, well, some of them as large as 18 pounds solid shot that would certainly smash through the hulls of any enemy ships that were sent against it. This fort was partially started before the war began. It was built in response to Spanish attacks on North Carolina in 1748. But again, it hadn't been completed, and it wasn't completed until well into the French and Indian War. But it does have a garrison throughout the entire conflict. Here we see a map of Fort Johnston here. Up at Ocracoke Inlet, earlier in the 18th century, there had been a lot of activity by pirates. People like Blackbeard were hiding out in all these different shoals and islands up here. And Governor Dobbs realized they needed a defensive point in that middle part of the coast guarding Ocracoke itself. And so on what is now Portsmouth Island, they constructed Fort Granville. Fort Granville was not quite as big as Fort Johnston was, but was a similar idea. It was, again, mainly an artillery battery guarding the waterway approach coming in there. To guard the Beaufort Inlet, where actually Fort Macon stands today, if you've ever been out to Atlantic Beach, there's a fort on this site of another artillery battery that was also called Fort Dobbs. It's led to a lot of confusion by historians in earlier years between this one and the one on the western frontier. This fort is never actually fully garrisoned. They basically complete the artillery battery that's there and a barrack house, but they never really have the money to keep a garrison of soldiers there permanently. But still, those are the main defenses we see on the frontier. And it's ironic that we have so much emphasis, placed on the coast, I should say, because when we do see violence hit North Carolina, it is very much on the western frontier, where we just have that one fort, Fort Dobbs. The Cherokee Indians living in the mountains of North Carolina actually started this war as allies of England. They had been England's allies since about 1730. They had helped the British defeat other Indian tribes here in the Carolinas that they were fighting. We actually saw a delegation of Cherokee travel to London and meet King George II to solidify that alliance. So when the French and Indian War begins, they have a very strong, not only military, but trading relationship with the British and the Carolinas here. They're sending tens of thousands of deer hides to the port of Charleston every year. And in exchange, they're getting all the European manufactured goods that their society has come to rely on by this point. We have an illustration here of some Cherokee headmen who traveled to London at the time of the war. Everything they're wearing is European made. They have Irish linen shirts, they have wool from Yorkshire, they have silver adornments that they have. They're certainly getting cooking utensils and cutting tools. Very importantly, they're getting firearms and ammunition, which have replaced bows and arrows pretty much entirely by this point, not only for hunting, but for warfare as well. So it's a very important alliance that the Cherokee have. The problem is they very quickly get into some tension with their English neighbors. Even as the Cherokee agree to send warriors north to fight the French and to fight their Indian allies, we see English settlement in the West continuing to grow. We see a constant movement of settlers moving down from Pennsylvania, where land is very expensive and where a lot of heavy fighting is going on. And they're coming down here into North Carolina. Land is cheap, it's a little bit safer, but again, the only direction they can go is west. So they encroach onto the Cherokees' land beyond our western frontier. Cherokee aren't too happy about this. Mainly the English are competing with them for those deer, for those game animals, not only that they rely on for food, but for getting those trade goods. We see the English build some forts in what is now South Carolina and Tennessee, supposedly for the protection of the Cherokees' families as their men go off to fight the French. The problem is you bring a garrison of soldiers in contact with these people, and there's a lot of cultural misunderstandings. We see some English soldiers misbehaving themselves with Cherokee women on different occasions, and again, it all contributes to a rising tension. Everything falls apart in 1758. We see as many as 500 Cherokee warriors sent north in that expedition against Fort Duquesne, along with the North Carolina soldiers. But many of them were treated pretty poorly by the British Army itself up there. They're promised when they leave all these presents that they can bring home, lots of these trade goods that'll be necessary. They actually get up there and the Army doesn't deliver. Or they say, well, we have to defeat the French first and then you'll get everything. But the English are taking a very methodical approach on that campaign. It takes them several months to go all the way across Pennsylvania, and the Cherokee get fed up. Most of them leave without even engaging the enemy, and they're going home empty-handed and pretty ticked off. On the way home through the Shenandoah Valley, some of these Cherokee help themselves to goods from the English settlers. They see it as taking payment for their service in defending these colonies. But the English only see, of course, their horses being taken from a pasture. They call out the local militia, and the settlers kill as many as 30 Cherokee men. So we have these allies starting to kill each other. In Cherokee culture at the time, blood vengeance for murder was the law of the land, basically. If someone from your family was murdered, you had an obligation to kill that person, or to kill someone from his family, or someone from his tribe if he was from a different nation. And so we see young Cherokee men head to the east in 1759, and they kill an equal number of English settlers for all those people that have been killed with theirs up in Virginia. So there's innocent people killed on both sides. And very quickly, before anybody can really do anything to stop it, we see a war between allies develop here in the Carolinas as the war with France is still being fought. South Carolina's Governor William Littleton is the most influential politician with the Cherokee. And at the end of 1759, after there's been some people killed on both sides, but it's not really an outright conflict, he leads he's met by a delegation of Cherokee headmen. He says he'll come up to talk to them. And at the end of the year, he brings an army of 1,200 South Carolina soldiers up towards the Cherokee country. He's met again by a delegation of 24 Cherokee leaders who have come to talk peace. But he basically says, you know, the treaty that stood between England and the Cherokee said that anyone of one nation who killed somebody from the other would be turned over for punishment. So he's demanding that these Cherokee murderers, in his eyes, are being turned over for execution by his government. But the families aren't turning them over. They're doing their cultural duty and revenging their loved ones. And so at that stalemate, Littleton takes these headmen hostages, and he holds them at a British fort called Fort Prince George. If you're familiar where Spartanburg and Clemson are today in South Carolina, that's where Fort Prince George stood. So he actually holds these men prisoner over the winter, and he agrees to exchange them as those murderers are turned in for punishment. None of them are. During that winter, we see smallpox break out in the fort there. Local Cherokee are concerned for the lives of their men that are inside, and they actually launch an attempt to free some of the prisoners. In the shooting that begins, the fort's commander is actually killed, and his soldiers kill all 24 of those headmen. They're being held prisoner just in the barrack. This begins an all-out war along the entire frontier. Within weeks, we see attacks everywhere from the Georgia border all the way up to modern-day Mount Airy and Winston-Salem area. And in early 1760, we have this outright flame of war that spreads everywhere. Governor Dobbs noted that there would be no peace or safety for his colony now that this had started. We see Cherokee attacks on dozens of settlers in the modern-day area of Statesville alone. Along the Yadkin and River valleys, there are a number of war parties that are patrolling in early 1759. Problem is, even Fort Dobbs can't do much to deter these attacks. The government, being what governments are, is trying to save money. And the year before, when the campaign had ended, the Cherokee were still allies, there was no threat to the frontier, they decided not to raise a new company of soldiers to send out to Fort Dobbs. So these attacks hit in the spring of 1759, and you only have the local militia who are able to gather together to try and defend each other. We see civilians take over Fort Dobbs for a couple of months and kind of make a makeshift defense there until a new company of provincial soldiers with additional artillery pieces are sent out. The British government does respond. The military responds. We see General Jeffrey Amherst in New York send a couple of regiments of regulars down to South Carolina. And in the summer of 1760, they mount an expedition against the Cherokee, again, going up through South Carolina towards the North Carolina mountains, where most of the Cherokee's towns are. This expedition of British regulars, South Carolina provincials, and South Carolina militia do engage the Cherokee. They have one major battle as they're going through the mountain passes just west of modern-day Asheville. And the British push the Cherokee out, but they lose about a quarter of their force in the process. They're not able to continue what they hope will be a campaign of destruction and retribution against the Cherokee, so they withdraw. All the regulars are actually sent outside the colony. So the Cherokee, for the moment, are victorious, but the British come back. We have Governor Littleton here on the right, and one of the Cherokee headmen, Ostenaco, who's one of the major war leaders during the war here on the left. These men are not on speaking terms, really, during this war. Ostenaco is himself leading quite a number of the war parties that go against the Carolinas. Littleton, after getting all this rolling, I should mention, after taking his army up and taking those headmen hostage, he says his job is done, he's had his military glory, and he's offered a post as governor of Jamaica, which he quickly retreats to. So his lieutenant governor, William Bull, is left in charge with this war that's ballooning of all proportion, basically. In 1761, we see another campaign by the English against the Cherokee develop. We see an army of about 2,000 soldiers, again British regulars and South Carolinians, move up once again into the mountains. At the same time, we have North Carolina provincials, including the garrison of Fort Dobbs, which itself had been attacked in 1760, move up and join Virginia troops. They're going down the Holston River Valley towards what is now modern-day Tennessee. So the British are kind of setting up a major pincer movement. You have one army coming up from South Carolina, one army coming down from Virginia, and catching the Cherokee population in between, basically. We see, again, a major pitched battle, almost at the same site of the previous year's battle at Covey Pass in the mountains. The British do push through. They are victorious this time. They don't lose as many men. The Cherokee are starting to run out of ammunition. their major trading partner had been the English. The English aren't giving them guns and ammunition anymore while they're fighting them. So besides the losses that they're taking in combat, they're just not able to physically keep shooting. And they end up melting off into the mountains as this British Army under James Grant moves around for about a month through the mountain villages and eventually destroys about 20 villages entirely, just burning them to the ground. Francis Marion, who will gain fame in the Revolutionary War, is one of the South Carolina soldiers on this campaign, and he said it brought tears to his eyes as he helped to raise basically thousands of acres of crops, cutting down corn and beans in the fields. This forces the Cherokee into starvation. They have no ammunition. They've taken heavy losses. Their villages are being destroyed. They don't have any food to eat. The few villages that are untouched are overwhelmed by refugees from these other towns coming in, and they're not able to continue fighting. And it's at that same time that this expedition of Virginians and North Carolinians is coming down the Holston River towards them. So we see some Cherokee leaders start to talk with the English commanders, and they do ratify an initial peace treaty in November of 1761. We see the final treaty concluded by December, which imposes pretty harsh terms on the Cherokee, actually. Basically, they have to cede several hundred miles of their territory in South Carolina. They are still required to turn over some of their people who have murdered some English settlers, and they lose quite a bit in this peace bargain. But North Carolina pretty much has the war end at that point. In 1763, the global war with France is concluded with the Treaty of Paris. The French, during the Cherokee fighting, have been defeated themselves up in Canada by the British Army, and they're not able to assist the Cherokee in that conflict. And we see an end to the worldwide fighting, again by early 1763. In North Carolina, there's no threat on the western frontier anymore. So while all of our forts are abandoned, Fort Dobbs was one of the first ones to be let go. We see the frontier move basically 70 miles west pretty much overnight as soon as the shooting stops. So they no longer require a garrison, they no longer require a fortification there. And unfortunately for us today, the site of the 3-story high fort was simply abandoned. The building was left to rot. Within a couple of decades, it had been disassembled, the site was cleared, and it became a plowed farmer's field. But in 1909, the Daughters of the American Revolution took it on themselves to protect the site of Fort Dobbs, which, as I mentioned, is the only French and Indian War site preserved in North Carolina. All those major, massive coastal forts, they're in the water today. Everything's eroded. So the site of Fort Dobbs in modern-day Statesville is our only connection here in North Carolina, our only physical connection to this First World War that's going on. We today are part of the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. We're one of 24 state historic sites. And through the efforts of a nonprofit support group, the Friends of Fort Dobbs, we're actively working towards a full-scale reconstruction of this 8,000 square foot barrack building, where we can better tell the story of North Carolina in the war and the story of the service of our provincial soldiers. I'd be happy to take questions for a few minutes if there are any. But before that, I just wanted to, once again, on behalf of the Division of State Historic Sites and the citizens of North Carolina, thank you for your time and thank you for your service today. I appreciate it. Are there any quick questions? I know we have birthday cake coming, but everyone knows everything? Outstanding. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. And now, representing the past, present, and future of the North Carolina Army and Air National Guard, would Mr. McMahon, Master Sergeant Kayampa, Staff Sergeant Dawson, Specialist Hunter, as well as Colonel Copeland, Command Chief Warrant Officer Herring, and our senior enlisted leader, Command Sergeant Major Swart, please come forward for the cutting of the cake. We of the North Carolina National Guard would like you to accept this pin set to mark with the year of the beginning of the North Carolina National Guard and this year, as well as symbolic images of the soldiers of these times as a token of our appreciation of you coming to speak with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us to learn a bit about our humble beginnings during today's celebration of the North Carolina National Guard's birthday, and in recognition of your service to our state and nation. This concludes the formal portion of the program. Everyone is invited to the atrium for a piece of birthday cake. Have a great afternoon.